Right now, inside the royal courts and defense ministries of the Gulf, a question is being asked that would have been unthinkable a decade ago. Can the United States still be trusted to protect us? And for the first time in almost 60 years, some of Washington's closest allies in the region are acting like the answer might be no. For generations, the relationship between the U.S. and the Gulf monarchies ran on a simple bargain. America got oil, military bases, and a foothold in one of the world's most strategic regions. The Gulf states got protection, weapons, and a security umbrella they didn't have to build themselves. It wasn't always comfortable, but it held. Today, that bargain is being quietly renegotiated, and the pressure came from two directions at once: a war that spilled further than anyone expected, and a strike that Washington didn't see coming and couldn't stop. To understand how deep that renegotiation runs, it helps to remember how unusual the old arrangement actually was. Countries like Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE built their entire security posture around hosting American forces, buying American weapons, and trusting that Washington's presence on their soil was itself the deterrent. For most of the last 30 years, that trust was rarely tested directly. What changed wasn't a single event, it was a sequence of them, each one chipping away at an assumption that had gone largely unquestioned since the Gulf War. Start with September 2025. Israel launched an airstrike inside Doha, Qatar, targeting Hamas leadership who were meeting to discuss a ceasefire proposal put forward by the United States itself. It was the first time Israel had ever struck inside a Gulf Cooperation Council country. More than 10 fighter jets were reportedly involved, flying a long-range route to avoid Arab airspace before striking a single residential compound. A Qatari security officer was killed alongside several Hamas members, and the strike badly damaged what had been a functioning diplomatic channel. Since Qatar had spent years positioning itself as the primary mediator between Israel, the U.S., and Hamas, Qatar hosts around 10,000 American troops at Al Udeid Air Base, one of the largest U.S. military installations in the Middle East. And yet, according to U.S. officials, Washington only found out shortly before the strike happened, not from Israel directly, but through its own military channels. President Trump later said he was, in his words, not thrilled about the whole situation, and the White House issued unusually pointed public criticism of an ally's military action. For Gulf leaders watching, the message was uncomfortable, regardless of how the words were phrased afterward. If a close mediating partner can be struck on sovereign Gulf soil, with U.S. forces stationed less than an hour away, and Washington can't or won't stop it in advance, what exactly does American protection guarantee in the moments that matter most? 8 days later, Saudi Arabia answered that question in its own way. On September 17th, Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman signed a strategic mutual defense agreement with Pakistan, a nuclear-armed state. The pact commits both countries to treat an attack on one as an attack on both. Pakistan's defense minister initially suggested the country's nuclear capabilities could be made available to Saudi Arabia under the deal, before partially walking that back. Analysts at Brookings and the Atlantic Council described the agreement less as a genuine nuclear umbrella and more as a signal, a hedge against uncertainty, aimed as much at reassuring Riyadh's own population as at deterring any specific adversary. Still, the timing speaks for itself. A Gulf monarchy that has relied on American security guarantees for decades reached for a second option within days of watching the first one fail to prevent an Israeli strike on its neighbor. Then came the wider war. On February 28 this year, the United States, alongside Israel, launched a direct military campaign against Iran, and Gulf states found themselves caught in the middle almost immediately. For weeks, Iranian missiles and drones struck military bases, airports, oil refineries, and data centers across Bahrain, Kuwait, Oman, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and the UAE, all 6 Gulf Cooperation Council states. A ceasefire on April 8 stopped most of the direct fighting, but Iran kept the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a large share of the world's oil exports pass through, effectively blocked for months afterward. Gulf states that had hosted American operations discovered that hosting comes with a cost. Their energy facilities and even desalination plants became targets for Iranian retaliation, even though the decision to go to war wasn't theirs. That set the stage for the most recent shock. On April 28, the United Arab Emirates announced it was leaving OPEC entirely, ending nearly 60 years of membership, effective May 1st. Officially, the UAE framed this as a purely economic decision, a move to free itself from production quotas and expand output toward 5 million barrels a day by 2027. And there's real substance to that explanation. The UAE had long been frustrated by caps that didn't match its growing production capacity. But regional analysts, including researchers at the Middle East Council on Global Affairs, point out the political backdrop is impossible to ignore. The exit widens an existing rift with Saudi Arabia, which prioritizes higher oil prices to fund its own economic transformation plans, while Abu Dhabi is betting on volume instead. It also signals something bigger, a Gulf state making a major strategic move without consulting its neighbors first, at a moment when Gulf unity was already under strain. So why does any of this actually matter beyond the region itself? For one, energy markets. OPEC's ability to manage global oil supply just got weaker at a moment when the Strait of Hormuz disruption had already rattled prices for months. Energy analysts note that OPEC's remaining spare capacity, the buffer it uses to absorb sudden supply shocks, shrinks without the UAE's contribution, which means future disruptions anywhere in the world could translate into sharper price swings than before. That has knock-on effects for what people pay at the pump from Tokyo to Toronto, and for how airlines, shipping companies, and everyday household budgets plan around fuel costs. For another, it matters for how much leverage Washington still has in the Middle East. The entire architecture of American regional power, air operations, naval deployments, intelligence sharing, has depended on Gulf states hosting U.S. forces without asking too many questions in return. If that cooperation becomes more conditional, more transactional, America's ability to project power in the region shrinks along with it, and that has implications well beyond this one region, since much of Washington's global posture relies on a dense web of exactly these kinds of basing arrangements. And for ordinary people watching from outside the region, this is also a preview of a broader shift, where longtime American allies increasingly diversify their security relationships instead of depending on Washington alone, whether that's Gulf states looking to Pakistan and China, or European allies debating their own defense independence after years of similar doubts about U.S. reliability. Now, it's worth being clear about what this is not. Multiple voices inside the U.S. security establishment argue this is being overread. They point out that Gulf states still have no comparable alternative to American military capability. No other power can match U.S. naval presence, air defense integration, or intelligence sharing at the same scale. From this perspective, what's happening is normal diversification, not the collapse of an alliance. Saudi Arabia signing a pact with Pakistan doesn't mean abandoning decades of defense cooperation with Washington, and the UAE has said its OPEC exit isn't directed at any particular country. Officials on this side argue that Gulf leaders are simply hedging their bets while a chaotic several years plays out, the same way any government would. On the other side, Gulf-focused analysts argue the shift is more serious than that. They point to a large-scale Arab Opinion Index survey released in early 2026, showing that 77% of respondents across the Arab world believe U.S. policies threaten regional security and stability, with an even higher share saying the same of Israeli policies. Their read is that something has genuinely broken in the psychology of the relationship. As one recent commentary in The Hill argued, once allies discover they're able to say no to Washington, they don't tend to go back to treating that cooperation as automatic. On this view, the pattern, the Pakistan pact, the OPEC exit, the reported outreach toward Iran and Turkey by Saudi Arabia, isn't coincidence. It's a Gulf region quietly building options it didn't feel it needed before. So where does this go from here? There are a few plausible paths, and nobody should pretend to know which one wins out. One possibility is that Washington moves to actively rebuild trust, perhaps through new formal security commitments or upgraded defense agreements with Gulf states, the kind of framework some U.S. analysts have already proposed as a way to reassure partners without a full treaty-level alliance. That could ease tensions considerably without reversing the diversification already underway, since Gulf states have made clear they still value American military capability, even as they hedge against relying on it exclusively. A second possibility is that this becomes the new normal. Gulf states continuing to hedge across multiple partners, including Pakistan, China, and even a cautiously repaired relationship with Iran, while still keeping the U.S. as their primary security partner, just a less exclusive one than before. This middle path looks on current evidence like the most likely direction, though that could shift quickly depending on events. A third, more uncertain path is further fragmentation, where continued instability in the region, another unexpected strike, another blockade, or a further breakdown in Gulf unity pushes individual states even further toward independent arrangements, accelerating a process that may already be underway. Which of these plays out likely depends on decisions made in Washington as much as in Riyadh or Abu Dhabi, and on whether the current relative calm across the region holds through the rest of this year. What's clear is this: the Gulf states are not walking away from the United States. Nobody credible in this space is suggesting a clean break, and Gulf officials themselves have repeatedly said as much. But the assumption of unconditional cooperation, the blank check that underpinned the relationship for decades, appears to be gone, or at the very least, seriously questioned for the first time in living memory. What replaces it is still being negotiated, quietly, deal by deal, defense pact by defense pact, oil policy by oil policy, and the choices made in the next year, by Washington, by Riyadh, by Abu Dhabi, and by Tehran, may end up shaping the balance of power across the Middle East for a long time to come.